Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Minor Compositions. For tonight's event, um, the idea is to have a discussion around some themes and ideas coming out of this forthcoming book, um, Anarchy and Alifuru by Satria Putra. Now, one of the difficulties of doing that is the author is in prison in Indonesia, and as excited as it would be to attempt to like smuggle in recording equipment to do an interview, that's probably a little bit beyond our budget. So the idea was to have to gather together a few folks to have some discussion on some themes of the book. So with that in mind, we are joined today by Ferdy. Hey, Ferdy.
Hello.
And Hypatia. Thanks for coming along.
Hi, Stephen.
And initially, we were going to be joined by Stefano Harney, but as Stefano is an international man of mystery, he's otherwise indisposed. He might come along, he might not. Okay, so maybe as a way to start, I'll kick off by saying a few things about how this book came about. I will tell you up front that I am not an expert on Indonesia. I know very little about Indonesia, aside from liking some music that I know from people who live there who do cool things, like Senyawa. Um, but last year, I got approached by some friends of some friends saying they were starting a new project called Page Against the Machine, and they wanted to work on translating writings coming out of Indonesian anarchist and activist circles. Would we be interested in working with them on this? I said, that's a good idea. Um, Now, the idea being that there has been relatively little of that writing translated into English. So I thought it would be a good way to sort of, let's say, have some more circulation of activist writing, anarchist writing, bring other perspectives into conversation that weren't being heard. And if the books go well, it would have the effect of also generating some funds that could be used to support a prisoner solidarity in Indonesia as well, which is good work. Now I didn't realize that everything was going to kick off in Indonesia this year. So it may have been fortuitous timing that it. So first book we decided to work on was this book, um, and we chose it for a few reasons. One is that it draws a lot upon the writings of people like David Graeber and James Scott, who I think are quite interesting. So it's has a sort of resonance in terms of shared areas of writing. And a second reason is one of the things that kind of I find strange. If you read a book like take a book like African Anarchism by Sam Mabah and Aye Garraway, it's a good book, but it's also with first we have to talk about Bakunin and Kropotkin and dead European guys. That's always the beginning. Um, this author has taken a somewhat different tack where he's like, oh well, if I want to think about radical politics in Indonesia, rather than talking about 18th century dead Russian guys, why don't I look into the history of where I'm from and how they've been written in ways that sort of, let's say, distort certain things or sort of get certain things wrong or ignore certain parts, like areas of islands that are basically ungovernable for many, many years. And I thought that was a really interesting approach of thinking about writing and going into the history. So that's what drew us into doing this book. So that's my sort of intro. So maybe I'll start first by asking either Hypatia or Freddie to kick off with um, what did you think of reading this, or what struck you about reading this particular text?
Yeah, first, thank you, Stephen, for inviting me and giving me the chance to read the book in advance. Um, yeah, I said yes to the invitation also because actually I'm not an expert on Eastern Indonesia, so a lot of my research are more focused I mean, my research more, or in general, focus more on queer imaginaries and in relation to religiosity in Indonesia, but a lot of focus on Islam. So and so that took me to more the western part of Indonesia, which is Sumatra. But I said yes to the invitation. Also learning about the profile of the or the background of the author. Like he is very young, but already kind of I saw and then I started to look at his previous work as well. He's quite prolific in that age. I think he's not even 30 yet. Um, um, but this idea of Alifuru, because as an anthropologist, of course, I'm more like I'm more familiar with the Zomian concepts, which like
Mm.
he also addressed in the book, where in the Zomian land or the peninsula Malay that as we know it, like you have this kind of pockets of resistance, um, but then that has very, I don't know, like different configuration when we talk about Alifuru, because it's also shaped by the geo geographical, but also like, like being in islands, it has different like way or structures of working or networking in terms of um, say organic anarchist society. Um, and yeah, I learned a lot actually through the text because I think Bima also actively like engaged with a lot of colonial texts way back, uh, which I found very studious but also at the same time bringing all this kind of newness into the conversation. You like I think he still mentioned Pruhan and Bakunin, but really at the last part in the
Mm.
conclusion, I think. But I guess we could never really escape those men. But at the same time, to really start with this kind of like indigenous forms or knowledge around collective governance, around opacity, or like how to basically refuse different institutions such as the state or the kingdoms in during the pre-colonial era, and then the colonial forces of Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch, as well as the current, nationalist regime that we have. Maybe I stop there. Maybe Hypatia also have something. Right.
No, no, that's good. I mean, if I was trying to like summarize the book in a half like glib version, I might say like it's Zomia but island Zomia instead of like Highland Zomia. And there you have different sets of ways in which the geography makes governance more difficult or less difficult. Um,
Yeah. Um, yeah, for me, I think what I found extremely useful and rich is this kind of this decentering of anarchism, one could say, but also decentering the the ways in which we conventionally think about Indonesia. You know, because um, when it's the way that we usually think of is because of you know the ways in which it's centralized. So it's very Java centric, or or Sumatra, or maybe it'll include some Bali, but the East always falls away from the conversation usually, but also within the nation state itself, right? It's understood as mainly peripheral areas where land is to be appropriated, is to be, where major extraction is happening, or moving, let's say, the capital to, Kalimantan and the ongoing struggles in West Papua at the moment. So it seems to me that that's a really important move to kind of decenter both anarchism, but also to decenter the conversations that we usually have around um, the Indonesian nation state historically and also in the present. So that's what I found very, very important. It's an anarchic move in itself, but I think it is a very kind of strong beginning of work, and hopefully Page Against the Machine can continue to translate and share voices and experiences of social organizing from areas that do not get so much attention within the field, let's say, of Indonesian studies. But he also makes a point in the beginning of the book, which I think is very important, is that Indonesia tends to fall away in general, especially within the field of what was post-colonial studies, which doesn't exist anymore in that sense. But within, let's say, anti-colonial, decolonial theory, Indonesia only really gets referred to, let's say, maybe because of the Bandung conference, but it's so marginalized within the field in general. So I think it's doing a lot of important things at the same time, addressing these erasures and silencing. And he does mention in the introduction something which I found really important, which he said he couldn't really address in this book, but the oral, the actual field work that would have to happen, or the oral actually speaking to the people who are still in these regions and gleaning insights from their own oral histories and traditions. So that would be maybe something to build on going forward as well.
Mm. No, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of the things to strike me with what the book is doing, which is, I guess, a more general kind of like social history from below kind of problem, is that, to use the cliche, history is written by the victors. And that means that you have large sections of history which will just disappear because they don't fall within the narrative structure or the attention of where the victors were looking. Um, and so the question is, well, what happened there? Obviously, not just nothing. So then, how do you get access to those histories? And it becomes more complicated, particularly if you're talking about forms of knowledge, which I mean, thinking here about the ways that states tend to privilege written records over or oral traditions. Um, and how would you even sort of get access to those things? And I think he's trying to recover those things, which I think is quite interesting.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is tangent. Speaking of histories written by the winners today, the new government of Indonesia just announced that Suharto and Sarwo Edi both are the perpetrators of the genocide in 65 are now being inducted as national heroes. uh, and today is supposed to be Hari Pahlawan Nasional, which is like National Heroes Day. So this is like the official. Um, this is tangent to what you're saying, but yeah, also supporting what you say about this history being written by the winner.
Mm. I mean, I guess that tends to indicate that even when you're trying to not allow erasure to happen, it's not something you do once and then go, oh, wow, that settles that. That's done now. It's something which happens again and again and again and again. Um,
Yeah, yeah, it has to. Um, it has to constantly reproduce itself. And also, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, he was general. Our current president was a general Prabowo he was a general under Suharto, no?
Yeah, and also he
It-
was former son-in-law Suharto, so
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So
oligarch.
yeah. So Yeah, it's interesting. Also, I came across while I was doing some research in relation to the book, and I came across also a conference that took place a couple of 1 second, let me try to find it. A few months ago, earlier this year, and 1 second. And it was essentially a conference between indigenous communities in Indonesia
Mhm.
that came together in Merauke, so the capital, in the city that borders Papua New Guinea and West Papua, and more than 250 members of indigenous and local communities gathered to demand an end of government-backed projects, which are under the label of strategic national importance, PSN, that are essentially land grabbing, right? And so
Mhm.
the people who were there were from all over the archipelago, from North Sumatra, Kalimantan, Papua, the Riau Islands, all over. And it seems that these policies that were put into place under our previous president are being ramped up by Prabowo now. It's like escalating. So all these different indigenous communities have come together and they're trying to create a unified front against this assault on their subsistence and their, one could argue, uh, societies that are, again, in the way that the author was showing us, not totally isolated from the state, but somehow finding a way to, uh, dip in and out of certain kinds of, there's what's so interesting I found about the ways in which these societies that he's writing about, the way that they have a realpolitik, to them, like they're like they would create alliances or they would do trade, but also somehow also sustain a kind of autonomy
Mhm.
that they insisted on. So yeah, I think that so many parts of Indonesia, even in extremely developed areas, you would still find,
Mhm.
because of the geographical terrain and because of certain kinds of uh, places that one could somehow uh, develop, continue within this kind of social organizing that was not totally captured by the state at all, or I think that this is going to be coming under more and more assault as we go forward,
Mm.
unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah.
I remember one argument of the book that I found really interesting, and this is getting a bit sort of like anthropologically into the weeds, but when he's talking about sort of the early colonial periods and the rise of the spice trade, particularly around clover, and talks about how many communities, were growing clover, but then as it begins to be part of colonial networks, you have almost like a hardening of divisions of who is involved in what part of the labor process. So you have those who like grow and pick, and those who process and export, and where the work of processing and exporting is rewarded much more highly than the work of growing and picking, and then how that distinction then hardens into a kind of like cultural ethnic category. So I found it quite interesting how something which is just like part of a sort of like a labor process,
Mhm.
seemingly incidental, can over time, with differences of reward or hierarchy, then sediment into something much different. And that's not sort of like a clear power coming saying, okay, we like you and you, but not you. It's almost like, I guess, it's a bit like how Son Rethel talks about like how commodity exchange creates categories in everyday life. Those differences in power through different placements in spice cultivation and exporting then led to different understandings in how people interacted, which is, I think, interesting and kind of wild.
Mm.
Yeah, there's something around like how I don't know, this is also like a speculation at this time because I think those who are given status of power by the colonialists um as a way, you know, to respond to the mobility of these Alifurians is that they create this it it's through a person, but they create these positions of distinct power and then basically trying to change, right? The or trying to break away or disrupt the kind of like the fluidity that forms the way the communities work, where before or most of them rely on this more consensus building, collectively, and then slowly it's kind of like taken over by this apa sih bandar? It's like the person who is in charge of the whole trading, and then they become either self-appointed kings or actually also supported by the colonial forces that time. Um, well, this is again a whole history of colonialism in many parts of the world elsewhere, but also especially in Nusantara in Indonesia at that time, where a lot of the like colonial imposition happened mainly or most of the time also to this kind of comprador, right? Like this operator, say, um, which kind of translates to the kind of I don't know which exact timing I forgot, but like the when there's the starting to have these kingdoms of Tidore and Ternate and then several kingdoms started to emerge as well, and while at the same time actually having Alifuru society still, you know, being in the fold, still within this kind of inter-kingdom relationship, but also they managed to stay autonomous.
Hmm. Um, if I could ask a more sort of speculative thought question, and if I'm
Mm-hmm.
going in a completely bizarre direction that doesn't work, just tell me so.
Mm-hmm.
I have a bunch of I have friends who live, for instance, in Singapore, and one of the things that they've told me, particularly let's say activists who are organizing around queer rights and inclusion, one thing they often face is being told, "Oh, why are you talking about this? This is a very Western framing. You're trying to bring these Western values into here, and why are you doing this here?" And the response is always like, "Well, no, actually, if you look historically." Like there across many parts of Southeast Asia, maybe South Asia, that historically before colonialism, there was much more fluidity of gender and gender roles. And it's
Mm-hmm.
actually the colonial project which actually tried to do away with that. Does that ring a bell, or am I imagining that?
Yes, because actually I'm a whole day writing about this
Yeah,
about
ring a bell.
ex yeah, this kind of basically framing that queerness as kind of like Western import and so on and so forth, right? But also what is interesting also to coming back to what Hypatia was saying, there's not, I mean, there's always attempts to look at this more historical, pre-colonial uh, um, understanding or notions of queer or practices same-sex practices, whether it's gender non-conforming practices. And it has been done by scholars, by activists alike. But again, this doesn't necessarily translate to, like, so no one's listening to it, basically, when it comes to like mainstream knowledge. Uh, it remains, well, actually, a lot of the tradition are still living today, uh, such as Bisu in south of Sulawesi, for instance. Um, mm, and so it's not a speculation, it's actually concrete, like no, practice and cultures that goes way back through time. But still, they even under the current pressure towards, I don't know, anti-gender politics or whatever you call it, but like this anti-LGBT pushback in Indonesia, they were also the ones who bear the brunt, like, while they're actually, maybe they don't have direct relationship to the discourse nor to the activism, but because they live this kind of like non-normative life, then um, they also become target, basically. So there's something about, yes, a lot of this research or studies are important, but then um, how then we kind of bring it to the table, which most of the time people are not willing to listen anyway.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's again this kind of problem with the kind of Western centric idea of queerness, which just erases again an entire, I mean, a global majority of, experiences of queerness, not only pre-colonially, but also in the present, which are have extremely diverse ways of expression, or tactics or strategies, or can align themselves with things that one might not expect. For example, correct me if I'm wrong, Ferdi, but I remember like De Utomo, he's a leading activist and scholar on queer Indonesia, and the argument, let's say, that there's a lot of queer activism within Islam, and a refusal to separate the two, actually, so these, I think it's really important, like the ways in which the author of this book is decentering anarchism, and so insistent, like in every closing of every chapter, he said, "This is anarchy," right? He goes, "This is anarchy." He says it over and over again because he's trying to, uh, it's like an anti-colonial insistence on what anarchy is. Yeah, and it's the same thing with queerness, or with feminism. I mean, like I'm thinking now of Intan Paramadita's work as well, who she's trying to again decenter feminism, not only from the West, but also from the nation, the ways in which the Indonesian nation state is so Java centric, or Jakarta centric, or Sumatra centric. And how she's trying to think about what she calls a trans-archipelagic decolonial feminism by decentering feminism, and again thinking of feminist activists in West Papua, or in the Maluku, in the Eastern Islands that we've been focusing on today. So I think that all of these different um, all of these different attempts, important works that decenter generally, like the ways in which the epistemic has colonized all of us. It's so telling when people talk about queerness and feminism in particular, because they really do just think for them it's just Western feminism or Western queerness. And I remember when the bill passed in India, when they were able to repeal the bill against homosexuality. I think it was a few years ago. A commentator said, well, finally, we've decolonized. It was a decolonial thing because those laws were imported by the British, right? So queerness is not something that now is, that because of some modern, the idea of Western modernity. It's always been it's always been a force, always, through time. So again, yeah, I think hopefully Page Against the Machine can also, or this attempt of bringing in more, and I think this is people really are more and more ready and more suspicious of Western discourses and
Mm.
knowledge, production. And so, yeah, anyway, it's just
Um,
my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, like we can also argue the other way around, right? Like homophobia and transphobia is actually imported from the West in a sense through colonialism by introducing gender category, by gender binary, I mean, and then kind of reproducing or kind of enforcing that through population management and so on and so forth. Uh, and then the actual connections nowadays taking form in funding from, Christian evangelists or Pentecostal to Africa to different parts of the world, and like this kind of like it's been mapped out already. So I think in terms of history, homophobia has a shorter, lifespan than queerness when it comes to uh, diversity in sexuality and gender, I should say.
um, maybe one thing to bring in here, and it's a little bit strange because it's actually not in the text, but I want to ask a little bit actually about Kunchi. I know you were involved in that Ferdy, and the reason why I want to mention it here is because just a minute or two ago you said something about how this information and the histories are sort of brought into discussion. And I'm thinking here about Kochi as a space that is it's a study space and a
Mm.
forum. Um, and I mean, having not been there, it struck to me it looks kind of like almost like what would happen if like cultural studies was more a forward outward facing sort of like public thing. And that struck me as interesting because because the way to bring things in discussion is probably not to publish them in an academic journal read by two people or behind a paywall, right? I'm thinking about spaces where you think bring things into discussion, maybe a bit like Kunchi, maybe I don't know. So I want to throw that to you and say if you maybe could say a bit more about or either of you could say a bit more about Kunchi and how that kind of spaces might factor into trying to bring these histories back into conversation.
Yeah, I think I'll be very biased when I talk about Fuji because I'm part of it since a very long time now. But yeah, I mean, I would say that Kunci is just one spaces out of many spaces in Indonesia. That is whether it's framed like institution, collective, a group of people, group of friends, or like connected through, and I don't know, maybe profession or hobbies and what have you. But I guess what we work on around study is because it's based on our own experience as students during under Suharto time, where there's so much censorship. There's a very top-down approach to education that I think a lot of us, or a lot of what we're doing is actually about the how to deal with this trauma together, like how
Mm.
it's, because it stays in our conduct, but also in our bodies, um, and in a way that I don't know, because there's a lot of phases where Kunchi kind of evolve. I think there was a the initial phase was of course when it was still a cultural study center, but also we always have these questions whether what do we mean by culture studies? It is something that we adopt from, you know, the UK, for instance, or by the Stuart Hall School, etc., which is actually also not that true. Yeah, we read those theories, but actually the spirit in that phase was actually to, again, decentralize knowledge, to make sure that knowledge that is uh, emerging not only in the university but also in activist spaces, in artistic spaces, doesn't just circulate within, but then trying to open and make connections between these different so-called fields, right? Because, like, again, coming back to, I'm afraid the example is Java, but when we talk about an artist, an ampu in during pre-colonial times, they're both, or they're not just scholars, but they're also like handicraft workers. They make uh, weapons, they make poetries, but also they have spiritual connection to. So this kind of like knowledge that, again, through colonialism is being separated, or kind of like
Mm.
siloed, that we want to open the silos again, and through I think Kunchi stands for this, and then this is also why we create the school now. It's been 9 years. We have a school called School of Improper Education. But
Mhm.
basically, it's the idea of about creating a space where we can lick our wounds together, but also kind of move on from there and trying to, you know, make new worlds through this kind of collective experiments.
Mm.
And I remember, I recall when I visited many years ago, there was also a project at that time that was working with certain communities that had been, I think they were living in this on in the riverbank or something. They had been displaced, if I right, am I remembering correctly, Ferdy? So this pedagogy it's not just confined to the study room of Kunchi, but it also was a project that involved many different struggles across many different communities in the Jogja region. So I think that that's also really important to mention. I remember that very well, and it makes me think a little bit about what Ferdy's saying, is that the importance, and I'm kind of glad that this conversation is taking this trajectory, because the importance of thinking about um, Alifuru and the struggles which are ongoing, and I mean most intensely in West Papua, which is is also a resisting through armed resistance, right, through armed struggle. So this struggle for indigenous autonomy and the right to subsistence and the right to a kind of statelessness, or to actually exit the state, um, which for the people struggling in West Papua, they see they see themselves as occupied illegally, right, by the Indonesian state. Um, these struggles, if in my view, should be also thought of with the struggles by the queer movement, as well as the feminist movement and all the struggles, the students movements, and in the farmers struggles across the archipelago, which funnily enough, I remember reading how the mainstream media and the conservative, more right-wing elements of governance a few years ago, when they were speaking of the demonstrations from the LGBTQ movements as well as the feminist movements, they described them as, correct me if I'm wrong, for organisasi tanpa bentuk, right? And which means
Formless
a
organization.
formless organization, right?
Mhm.
And that's why they're dangerous, and it kind of trying to invoke the specter of communism, right, as this this constant specter that has to be reinvoked, and that any movement that goes against the state, whether it's for queer rights or women's rights or farmers' rights or the indigenous rights, are put under this one umbrella of being an organization without form, right? And this is inherently what is dangerous about it, because they try to bring the specter of this communism that they had to exterminate. And I find it so interesting in relation to thinking about the anarchic, right? And how the state itself names its it names it in this very quite poetic, I find, formlessness, the formlessness. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's almost like the element of formlessness is the danger because it could be many different things, and things which are fixed are preferred because they're known as opposed to yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a nice, actually for me it's a nice image, like it's a nice it's a good image, this formless organization, because it's still organized, but they kind of, because of its shapelessness, it kind of go through the antithesis, of life, like and maybe actually it's good that they see it as a threat, but not in this way, like in terms of like persecution and criminalization, but like having this kind of fluidity and moving within society yeah, and create, again, I think a form of resistance to the norms.
Yeah, absolutely. And a kind of fugitivity, not only in terms of its formlessness in the ways in which it moves through the structure, but also by its makeup, in the sense that it's everything that the state deems as the internal enemy, right? It's the
Mm,
queer, it's the woman, it's the indigenous, it's
mm,
the farmer resisting the land grabs, the worker, the laborer, etc., the student. It can be, it's and that would be maybe this is also why I find this book so valuable, because we, to not only for its historical research, but also to remind us and to reignite a kind of sense of all of these struggles across this archipelago. And not only, right, because he's suggesting that this is something that is a planetary question, right?
mm,
And so to think about how do we link up across our differences, um, uh, our struggles, and
mhm,
have this formless organization,
I think
and grow. Yeah.
I think what I find quite interesting is how those shared norms or maybe even protocols around temporary organizing forms can be shared and then repeated again and again. I'll give you a silly example. A number of years ago, I was in Delhi in India, and like you get to this road where it's this quite wide road, and there's lots of traffic, like cars, trucks, like little tuk-tuks. Throw in a random elephant or two. It looked like I'm looking like, how the hell am I going to cross the road, right? Like trying to cross it by yourself would be insane. And then because there's no traffic lights, there's nothing to stop it. And then my friend's like, oh no, watch, this is cool. And then I watched as you waited a few minutes till enough people gathered together to form a mass. And then we collectively crossed the road because we stopped traffic. Now there's like no formally stated about rules about like wait till you have 50 people and then cross, but like everyone knew that's what you do.
Mhm.
And I thought that was super interesting.
I like that, Stephen. Yeah.
I mean, other methods of crossing the road are also available, but still, I just thought it was an interesting thing to see.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. I mean, he talks about that. He talks about divide and conquer, and he traces the ways in which, people were, these societies which were, he shows us through the historical record, they were essentially egalitarian, consensus driven. Of course, they had their warring, but it was more play, the importance of play. Uh, you might have a figurehead, but nobody really, but the decisions were taken, by the people. The
Mhm.
women had very important roles, not only in this part of Indonesia, in other parts as well, of course. Um, and yeah, it seems that um, the way in which these other ways of organizing life is one way that colonial powers, and still are doing very, very intensely at the moment, is through divide and conquer. So yeah, you, we have to cross that road together, as many of us together, Stephen.
Yeah, but that reminds me also of actually Malik's is here. Malik spoke about the surrounds, uh about this improvised collaboration, right? How as a frame of mind, Alifuru kind of reminds me on how actually they also work with local kingdoms, on warlords, but also when they don't align, then they work with the colonials at some point. But and also then it shifted again, and there's this kind of like informality, I would say, or like this temporary alliances. So not the alliances is not then enforced into like I don't know an organization or even like naming it as a kingdom or so, but how then they learn it's part of their modes of survival, of course, but also they kind of find space to create a new world, a new relationship out of this kind of um, fluctuative relationship or relational. I don't know what you call it. Like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do other folks have any questions or thoughts you wanna throw into the mix? No pressure if you don't, just bring it up in case you do. Okay, that's okay. Um, so Hypatia, this is where I'm going to attempt to very badly try to remember what I remember previously you were writing about history of sort of noise and performance in Indonesia. Am I getting that vaguely correct?
Yes, yes.
Um, I'm just kind of wondering, do you see any ways in which the sort of history that's being narrated here has any relationship to the work you were doing previously, or is it just something completely different? And
Um,
the reason I'm asking is because oftentimes I would think the history of sound, because it's much more ephemeral than records, written records, might be even harder to recover, but maybe not. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here.
yeah, I mean, okay, just to give a little bit of maybe context for uh, the participants of this call. Um, in my research, I've been very interested in coming out of performance studies. I've been very interested in the performative force of the Indonesian national language, specifically as an anti-colonial political project. And then the ways in which, after the genocide of 65 to 66 and the installing of the CIA dream, which was the military regime of Suharto for 32 years, that this linguistic anti-colonial project that was essentially a project of emancipation and a kind of a future communicability in a way, because most of those revolutionaries of, let's say, the 20s, when they released the Sumpah Pemuda, didn't even, that language hadn't been fully formed or standardized yet, right? So it was a language of the future. It was an anti-colonial horizon. So I'm interested in how, after the genocide and because of censorship and repression of language in particular, a lot of artists, and we see this still today in the very kind of active and vibrant noise scene, a lot of artists, whether in poetry or theater, were engaging with paralanguage, you know. In other words, the non-verbal, the non-lexical aspects of language, you know, like signs and sounds and gestures and I mean, Senyawa is a great example of, you know, when Ruli Shabara, you know, is kind of speaking in tongues almost, right? But you see it across many different forms. So I'm interested in the question of the materiality of language itself as a means, and so that's essentially what I look at. And the questions that I was thinking about when I was reading the book was the question of language in terms of you know, how would we be able to hear, let's say, if we were to be able to listen to the oral histories and traditions and the memories of the people who still live in these parts of the archipelago, you know, how many of them speak the national language? How many of them? How much of, let's say, that statelessness, if it still exists today, is also a linguistic one, in the sense that, you know, they might not have entered into the institution, you know, the school, the institutionalized, to become a subject of the Indonesian nation state, you know, which is to learn Indonesian at school, you know, even though it might not be the language of your home, right? So of your village or of your region. So I was thinking about that question of language and how, what are the languages that are being spoken there, if they are still if they still exist, and how much institutionalization has happened in those regions as well in the present day through state schooling, and so these were questions that I would have been able to ask the author myself, and
Well,
I hope that he's doing well where he is. And
well, it's
yeah,
interesting because when I've talked about some of these things with Raleigh, he sort of, I think, was trying to tell me that, like, Indonesian is less like one language and more like 10 different languages in a trench coat. Um, but in a way that seems quite common, where, I mean, isn't the usual joke that, like, a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy? That, like, there's almost this process of, like, state formation where you have to sort of, like, create that standardization to then have, you, like, you know, you have the official language. Or maybe.
yeah, I mean, in the Indonesian case, it's interesting, you know, I mean, like, one, it's one of the few um it's one of the few, let's say, uh, nations that, after it gained its independence, in quotation marks, it didn't retain the language of its colonizers, right? I mean, but that's also because of the particular history of the ways in which the Dutch themselves didn't impose Dutch as the language of the archipelago, and kind of standardized a form of Malay, which was the base of the lingua franca kind of, of the archipelago. And I think it's because of the archipelagic maybe geography of this nation state that we call Indonesia today, that might have played a role in the reason why the Dutch themselves didn't. I mean, of course, people learned Dutch, but they were of a particular class, and they'd had certain administrative roles within the colonial administration. But for me, it's interesting how the revolutionaries, the youth movement, they chose Indonesian as the national language, I think, because it was also a language that didn't really belong to any particular people. It was right, Ferdi, it was a language of the archipelago, because it was a language of trade, and but it didn't belong, let's say, to this. It wasn't what the Javanese were speaking, or the Balinese, or the Sumatran. So it was a kind of politically smart, to not have a, even though I think that this is why. But it's a fascinating language in term because it's a language of the sea and the archipelago. It is what Ruli's saying, because you have words in it. You have Sanskrit, you have Arabic, you have Austronesian, you have Portuguese words. Yeah, you have
Dutch,
all
English.
kinds of vocabularies in it. And then you have a huge separation between formal Indonesian and then the Indonesian that we speak every day.
True.
Which is also a huge difference in
That was interesting about choosing Indonesian as it wasn't already the language of a particular group, and it reminds me a little bit here, different context, of the way in Singapore that English becomes the national language because it's not already the language of one of the different communities, one of the component communities. So, for instance, not choosing Mandarin or Hindi, because it would be too much in favor of one particular community.
I mean, speaking of language, Stephen, so is this book written in Indonesian then translated to English, he wrote it directly in English?
It was written in Indonesian and translated, yes.
Okay.
And it was translated by his comrades in Page Against the Machine. So yeah, so I haven't read the original, but
It's great that you
and
read
is
it.
he from? I'm looking at I'm trying to find his bio now, because I'm wondering whether here it is. Yeah, so he was born in Kalimantan. Yeah. So I think this is the thing, that they might have chosen the thinking behind the choice of the language was not to privilege one part of the archipelago more than the other, but that has happened. I mean, at the end of the day, politically, economically, but also within the scholarship, right, that has been produced, particularly from the West. It's and particularly within anthropology, it's the discourse is prevalently on Java, Bali, Sumatra. This is where the power emanates from, in the archipelago, and this is why I find this book so important as well.
Cool. Well, I'm thinking, maybe I'll ask maybe like one or two more things, and we can nudge ourselves not towards a conclusion, but nudge ourselves to a pause in proceedings, and then keep talking if we want or not want to. So what I'll throw out is maybe as a sort of way to do that is I'll throw this to both of you or anyone who wants to answer is if we're trying to approach this book, not just thinking about what it tells us about the history of these particular islands, but things that we might learn from it that are applicable elsewhere in the world, what do you think we could sort of like learn from this narrative that might, outside of the particular historical context for elsewhere, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
You know, what might Alifuru world look outside of Alifuru, or is that just the wrong question altogether? Maybe it would be something completely different.
Mm.
Probably would be actually.
Maybe I start by like also reflecting on what you said earlier, Hypatia, about language, about how the formal and informal kind of are in the same space. Um, and how then they also like there's always a level of this informality when it comes to, I don't know, talking about resistance, protests, but also like at everyday life in Indonesia. And I think this is pretty like uh, it resonates also with what happening recently with the recent protests in Indonesia in a few months ago that escalates to violence, right? Um, and how um, this mind frame or this I keep calling it mind frame, I don't know what, but this trajectory of um, being together in a kind of provisional way um, that allows certain action to happen collectively, but also not romanticizes it or avoiding to romanticizes it or by by naming a group or by identifying as a collective and so forth is something that I think also happening in different aspects or different forms of uh, I would say rebellion or resistance to in different parts of the world, I would say. Um, but then having Alifuru as a kind of I know it's not the original point, but like as a reminder that this has been always been the case in histories, um, give us a bit like I don't know hope. I don't know for the lack of a better word, but like because every like because it feels like when you are in the crisis, when you are in the moment of oppression and so on, things are looking always so bleak. Like actually, like I often question myself, what am I doing actually, knowing that all the uh, you know the dictators are still there or they getting more power and so on and so forth to an extent that yeah, it's disheartening, but actually knowing also throughout the history that this kind of space they're never totally erased, they're never totally captured, uh, but at the same time also they're reachable, they're not somewhere outside of out of our environment or neighborhood. I mean, Alifuru is far, of course, but there are this kind of readiness for action that is based on our common experience, our like witnessing to what happened, and I'm slowly losing track of my thought now. But basically coming back to Alifuru, yeah, it's a good reminder. It's kind of put us back on the track, like knowing that. Uh, state perhaps could never be fully abolished, but also it's never total. It's never total. It's never absolute. There are always spaces within and around it that that allows us to exist and to thrive, basically.
Totally agreed. I mean, to me, a lot of what's being said here in the book resonates in a different context, but with a
Mm,
lot of things that, for instance, our mutual friends Fred and Stefano would be talking about.
mm,
I'm not saying this is like the Indonesian undercommons, but maybe it is in a way.
Yeah, I agree. That's exactly what I was thinking about when I was listening to Ferdy now, and how it's everywhere. It's not. It's happening everywhere. Um, it's happening in places near and far. And yeah, I was thinking very much when reading the book on the struggle of West Papua
mm,
and the taboo, the criminalization of speaking of the active genocide that's happening in West Papua by the Indonesian state in the service of gold companies such as Freeport and BP, and how there seems to be at this moment a really intense and kind of protracted, but it's also a very intentional armed struggle against against the totality of global capital, right?
mm,
From West Asia to Southeast Asia to uh, in the imperial core. It's an extremely uh, it's we're in a state of war. We've always been in a state of war, but it feels that these histories that we were reading about in this book are so much part of the struggle that we are, like Ferdi saying, they're alive, and I appreciate so much the author insisting on keeping this alive. That it
mm,
won't fall away from the historical record. These struggles speak to our struggles today, not just indigenous struggles, but also struggles against empire everywhere, right? So, and this is the historical moment we're living in extremely profound and um, I mean, there's no words really. Sometimes I'm at a loss of words, and I think of when I try to process what has been happening especially in the last couple of years. But again, this is why I kept on
mm,
thinking about West Papua when I was reading this book, because what does it mean like for us to actually be materially and actively part of that resistance? That
mm,
it's not just something that's happening. You know what I mean? Like, how are we part of that resistance, right? Together. How do we materially support it wherever it's happening? Because they are these people all over this planet, people all over the planet right now who are actively organizing and actively uh, confronting
mm,
the military might, right, of empire. So it was a really wonderful read to see that longue durée,
mm,
you know. I mean, I think of like there was an island in the Alifuru space called Run, which was traded by the British and the Dutch. Um, the Dutch gave the British New Amsterdam for Run. New Amsterdam became New York, right? I mean, if you think about like how important actually within history, right? This tiny little island in the Alifuru region, what an important role it played. It New Amsterdam became New York because the Dutch gave Manhattan to the British in exchange for Run because they wanted the nutmeg and the cloves and this. So this is the thing with Indonesia, right? It always falls away from the longue durée, the arc of world history of where we find ourselves in the moment, and yet it played such a kind of important role, right? In all of these geopolitical kind of moves that so yeah.
That is indeed super interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe a good place to pause and thinking about the what roles vary that each of us can play in being connected to that, and thinking about if the author in a prison cell in Indonesia can find a way to recover certain things, and people everywhere can find a way to do certain things. But yeah, well, thank you very much for that. Thanks to both of you.
Yeah, and if there's any way we can support our comrade, in any material way as well, let us know.
We'll do.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen.